Marvel movie, you've seen the hero type plot. The idea is that the EU is a character with its own aspirations. It's a diverse character that has all kinds of different aspects, and China is treated as a flat character, as a character that is either assisting the EU's in marginal ways or mostly challenging the EU. It's acting like the dragon in the hero type story.
What we have is increasingly divergent narratives on the economic relationship between Europe and China, where we don't refer to the reality, but nevertheless, this is part of it, that even the basic economic facts of, say, trade or investment become disputed.
I want to connect fear with knowledge. Once you start having fear, it also means you basically turn away from wanting to know more about the thing that causes you fear. So you get into a downward spiral where fear induces lack of knowledge, but lack of knowledge induces even more fear, because it is always the unknown that you most fear of.
Narratives are blending the past, present, and future into a story about where we want to go together. Good stories are powerful because they're able to transport us to that place. China and Europe seem to be turning each other into increasingly flat characters. Retracing a shared plotline requires responsible communication by academics, think tanks, and politicians. Welcome to Cosmolab, a series of 12 conversations on the complexity of our relations with China. This conversation is about narratives and China-Europe relations. Narratives shape our understanding of ourselves and our relation to others and the world. But what happens when we narrate? How do we construct narratives? And do they construct us back? I'm very happy to be talking on these questions with great guests. You bring a couple of decades of China and Europe experience to this conversation. Ágota Révész, welcome. You're a sinologist. You're working on the theme of public diplomacy and knowledge production in the China in Europe Research Network. That abbreviates as CHERN and is a European sister network of our Dutch China Knowledge Network. Welcome, Steven Langendonk. You're a postdoc in international political economy at the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg, Germany, and researcher in international and European studies at the Louvain Catholic University in Belgium. And welcome to Duncan Freeman. You lecture at the Brussels Management School, and prior to entering academia, you worked as a journalist, a publisher, and researcher in China and Hong Kong for 15 years. Your current research focus is on the political economy of the EU-China relationship. Ágota, maybe I can start with you. The three of you are co-editors and co-authors of a book on narratives in Europe-China relations. What triggered you to write this book, and how did you find each other on this subject?
Actually, it was quite simple because we have this working group in CHERN called Public Diplomacy and Knowledge Production. This working group is coordinated by me, and all of us are members there. So it basically grew out of several activities within the working group. Formerly, sinologists or China studies scholars were rather considered to be the ones who assist political decision makers, assist thinkers, how to best integrate China into an existing global order. But this is no longer the task. The task is how to best understand China, to understand what visions China has about future world order, to understand how China sees us. So it's no longer about this, I would say, missionary zeal towards China, but I mean, we need to shift the focus of our work, and it also means we need to shift the narratives. So also about us, I was invited to talk about EU-China relations. And after this online event, there was also, after the presentation, there was also a Q&A session. And during this Q&A session, someone put his hand up and asked me, but Mrs. Révész, there is one thing I couldn't quite get clearly from your presentation. Are you actually for or against China? And I was just like, I cannot possibly answer this question. I mean, that's not what I'm doing. I mean, I'm trying to understand China. And then his response was, but you know, Mrs. Révész, there will come a time soon when you will also have to pick a side. And it was like a boom exploding in my head. For me, it was a turning point. There is a very clearly discernible polarization in the narratives. We are narrating black and white stories, especially here in Europe or in the West, if there is such a thing, so in general. And it goes back to Manichaeism. It goes back to Zoroastrianism. Of course, Manichaeism also got to a certain extent into Christianity. So it's always about the good and bad. And these are the stories that we keep telling. These stories have also been further strengthened, I would say, in the past almost 1 century. So definitely from the 1930s by Hollywood movies. So it's always about the fight between the good and evil. And we just stick to that. So it's also very convenient. But of course, it means that you have to pick a side because that's also your responsibility.
You talk about Manichaeism and you draw a line to Hollywood. So if that is the short version of, I would say, the European cosmological worldview, but how does that relate to the Chinese one?
What the Chinese worldview, I would say, is very different. So, of course, you have a kind of dualism in China or in the Far East, I would say. If you think of yin-yang, so that's the basis of Taoist cosmology. The qi is separated into yin and yang. But it is only seemingly dualistic. So also, if you look at the image, you can't see that the idea is rather that the two complement each other. And the idea is that there are 4 relationships between them. They are coexistent, they are interactive, they are interchangeable, and they are mutually inclusive. And especially this mutual inclusivity, I find very, very, very important. This is something that is actually very, it is in complete opposition as to the way we narrate the state of things globally. There is this warfare. We are on a battlefield of narratives on a daily basis.
Stephen, I'd like perhaps to take the discussion even a bit further on what we are actually talking about when we talk narratives. I mean, your book is really treating this in depth. But how can we understand narratives? What are they, and how do they work when we narrate? What is happening?
When we narrate, we are grasping together the past, the present, and the future into a story. Right? We're grasping together events to tell a story about where we want to go together. Yeah. And sometimes the target audience can be narrow, such as in the case of Dutch politics or German politics. And in other cases, the audience is pretty broad, as you can see, for instance, in UN level narratives about global politics. narratives are powerful because they're able to transport us. They're able to stand in for experience. I think that oftentimes we are so bound up in narratives of international politics, scholars as well. We have our realism, we have our liberalism, we have our theories, that we don't realize that these are thinking tools that have been developed to tell stories about international relations. And so we start to treat these theories, and I mean, this is outside of scholarship too. This is you can think about this when you're looking at the European Union with the various, I mean, the strategic outlook of 2019. These are thinking tools that allow people to subsequently tell different narratives of international relations, right? So it makes little sense to distinguish between reality and narrative. I mean, the one and the two are bound up together.
You wrote a chapter on, with a very interesting title, by the way, called "The Unicorn, the Dragon, and the Storytellers," on this comparative praxis in EU foreign policy communities. Why did you choose this title?
Well, it's actually exactly to point to the fact that the EU and China as such, when we really go and look for them, they don't exist outside of the stories we tell of them. So why the unicorn and the dragon? It actually refers to a book that was co-edited by Umberto Eco back in the 90s, an anthropologist and also a multidisciplinary scholar, who tried to develop an anthropology of the West from the perspective of China, or the perspective of, you know, the encounter with other cultures. And the book was titled La Licorne et le Dragon, and the idea is, you know, these are different cultures. They have different perspectives on one another, but you know, it's exactly through dialogue that we can get to a, let's say, a more fundamental understanding. In my chapter, the unicorn refers to the European Union and the dragon refers to China, and I use these as a way to say, you know, okay, instead of looking at what these actually are, we should just focus on what stories are told about them. Now, in that book, Umberto Eco talks about Marco Polo as well, and I think that's a very nice illustration for what it means to take a narrative perspective on politics. Marco Polo went to China, and he mistook alligators for dragons and rhinoceroses for unicorns, right? And we might say, from our modern perspective, I mean, it's very silly, right? Obviously, this medieval Marco Polo or Renaissance guy, he just didn't know what he was looking at, right? He was just making a mistake. But actually, in fact, he was just applying the thinking tools that he had at the time about, you know, what does a unicorn look like and what does a dragon look like, and, you know, identifying these for his audience back home. And I think that when we try to distinguish between these kinds of stories and the stories we tell about international politics, then we are mistaking, you know, that, you know, they're not that fundamentally different.
Maybe to have you talk on how we can understand these EU level narratives of China and what multiple identities or who is actually talking in these narratives.
So I got interested in EU level narratives of China after the strategic outlook was published back in 2019. I was at that time immersed in the Brussels bubble via my connection to the Egmont Institute in Brussels. So I was attending regular think tank meetings and such. And this was seen as a sea change in this community, right? The strategic outlook was seen as something that really changed the whole picture. And I found that quite interesting because from my perspective as an outsider, I didn't really see that much different. Not much had changed, right? So the European Commission and the EAS were talking about treating China like a cooperation partner, a negotiation partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival, and that has become a framework to talk about China in EU politics. So for this chapter, the research I conducted over the past 4 years, actually, I compare 3 different communities that all contribute to, let's say, the EU level narrative. So, of course, I look at the political storytelling by von der Leyen, by the European leaders, and by and such. But I also consider policy-oriented narration or policy-oriented storytelling, which is done by think tanks. And I also look at EU studies. And by comparing these different types of stories that are told in these three different communities, we can say something about, why is it that this is the story of China that we ended up with? Why didn't we end up with a different story?
I can ask you, what do you conclude if you reflect on the comparison you've made, and what is the answer to the question you just asked?
I studied each of the communities differently, but I tried to use as much in-person or experience near data, so interviewing and ethnographic research as possible. So I concluded basically that for reasons internal to European studies, the idea of Europe as a normative power, as a liberal power, a power that is very different from China, that actually continues to echo in EU discourse, but its influence on the overall narrative is relatively marginal. It's more in authorizing this, let's say, this self-conception of the EU as unique, as special, as great. For the think tank side, for the policy-oriented storytelling, I found that oftentimes people think of think tanks as quite powerful knowledge brokers, but in fact, they face a lot of incentives not to challenge political narratives, which means that they tend to they follow along with shifting political narratives and then try to generate concepts that are then taken up by storytelling at the political level again. What's important to note is that these two communities, EU studies and think tank and policy-oriented storytelling, they're really focused on the aspect of characterization, which means they're really focused on what is the EU and what is China, right? And that sets them apart from the final group, which is political narration, political storytelling, what politicians do. They're really focused on emplotment, which means how do we put these characters together in a plot of, in a story plot of what their relationship is like. And what I find, in fact, is that although a lot of people see the strategic outlook as a big change, it repeats a very typical plot in EU storytelling about itself, which is the hero type plot. And the hero type plot is basically, it's a very common and well-known plot type, especially in Western storytelling. If you've seen a Marvel movie, you've seen the hero type plot. So the idea is that the EU is a character with its own aspirations. It's a diverse character that has all kinds of different aspects, and it faces these great challenges because of geopolitical competition and COVID back in the day. And China is treated as a flat character, as a character that is either assisting the EUs in marginal ways or mostly challenging the EU. It's actually it's acting like the dragon in the hero type story, right? The EU has to find a way to slay the dragon. That's the overall, the implicit story of many political speeches.
Duncan, perhaps I can ask you if that same emplotment game is part of your chapter. You wrote a chapter together with Ágota on China, Europe, and dual circulation. So on the emerging narratives of China's economic model. I just wonder if you can explain a bit how this narrative of dual circulation, where did it come from? How did it spread? And how did Europe respond to it? And if you recognize actually the things that Steven has just shared with us.
Our chapter looked at precisely the creation of the narrative of dual circulation, the transmission externally of dual circulation, the narrative of dual circulation, and then also the response to the narrative from China, outside of China. So we look at these three aspects, and quite clearly, if you look at dual circulation and the history of how it was created and then transmitted within China, it is very much a top-down process. So it embodies, in a sense, this very general view of the world and of China that comes from Xi Jinping thought, and then is transmitted through official documents, unofficial documents, think tanks, academics, and so on within China. What we find is that if we look at how dual circulation was transmitted outside of China, and we say, for instance, compare it to other strategic narratives that have been used in China, there was very, very little attempt by the Chinese government to transmit and persuade people outside of China that dual circulation was something which they should be taking into consideration, or even using it to influence the behavior of other actors. If we compare it, for instance, to the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, where enormous resources were used by the Chinese government in Europe, in Africa, almost everywhere in the world, to present this to the outside world, and to influence behaviors in the outside world. There's very, very little of that work which was done by the Chinese government. So in a sense, the reactions outside of China, in Europe and elsewhere, to dual circulation have been more or less left up to those who receive the narrative outside of China. And so we look at the reactions, the counter narratives, if you like, which also have not been necessarily from a top-down level. You can occasionally find European officials, politicians who refer to dual circulation, but a lot of it has been left to think tanks, to the media, to formulate narratives about China's dual circulation. And what we find is that these are very much, they're not, well, partly they are embedded in the immediate reaction to the relationship which we have currently with China, but that they are also very much rooted in historical narratives of China as the other, as a reactive power, as a power which is seeking to counteract the West, and that these are the frameworks which have been used by the framers of the narrative outside of China.
Actually, that pictures a very clear image of two narratives interrelating, but perhaps not communicating. I mean, they're just as if the deaf and the blind.
I would say that, yes, you could say this, that what we have is increasingly divergent narratives on the economic relationship between Europe and China, where we don't refer to the reality, but nevertheless, this is part of it, that even the basic facts, economic facts of, say, trade or investment become disputed. They become the basis for narratives which are totally divergent and totally different. So yes, the EU has its narrative of the economic relationship with China. And Steven already has referred to this strategic outlook, where this division of views or ways of perceiving China was first promulgated by the European Union. But there, what we can see is that there is underlying this, and also in the 2016 Commission document on China, there's this fundamental aspect, which is that there is an imbalance in the relationship with China. And so you have this narrative of a need for reciprocity, for a level playing field, which has become fundamental to the EU policy approach to China on economic matters, which is not one which is generally accepted by the Chinese, but it is fundamental. It becomes really the basis of the economic analysis of this relationship with China. And this continues to today, although today it has shifted somewhat, and we now, from the European Union, we talk about things like critical raw materials, we talk about risk, strategic dependencies, and the theme of de-risking in the relationship with China, which of course is something which certainly in the Chinese narrative of the relationship with the European Union is not talked about, or certainly not talked about in the same way. So yeah, there is this fundamental divergence of narratives, even when supposedly we can refer to a factual basis of economic analysis of what does the trade deficit mean. We know how much it is, but what does it really mean becomes fundamentally disputed between the two parties.
The next question would obviously be, can you flag those areas in how these narrations of the unicorn and the dragon actually touch on something they share, where they converge, such as our planetary predicament or on climate, even though it's very abstract. So, and if we can use those elements where there is convergence still remaining in these two narratives, that we could build on, or is this a too positivist type of approach?
Well, I think that is a very interesting question, and it used to be, and even today, quite often when you have discussions, say between the EU and China in seminars and workshops, we spend a lot of time talking about these differences and divergences. And at the end of the conversation, very often somebody says, well, can we talk about the positives? Can we talk about where we can cooperate? And generally, the most obvious thing to talk about is climate change and the existential threat of climate change. And I think that used to be certainly the case, where you could look at the EU and you could look at China and their narratives, their policy approaches on climate change were very much convergent. And they, or at least they had become convergent at the time of the Paris Agreement, certainly vis-a-vis the United States and what happened with Trump afterwards. This had become a point of real convergence between the EU and China. But I think what has happened in more recent years, since the Paris Agreement, is that climate change itself and what flows from it, if you look at energy policy and you look at renewables and you look at the technologies that underlie the policy approaches, the solutions to climate change, then they have become increasingly themselves areas of contestation, geopolitical contestation. We talk about technological sovereignty in Europe. We talk about this, really the securitization, what has become the securitization of not just energy in general, which very much came from the Ukraine war and the dependence on Russian fossil fuels, but now even solar panels, electric vehicles have become not just a technological issue or an energy policy issue or even a trade policy issue. They have become a security issue. The dependence on Chinese solar panels is also an energy dependency. It's a technological dependency. The dependence on electric vehicles from China fundamentally impacts our industries. Also, it's a technological dependency, and theoretically also it becomes, because of, for instance, the fundamental importance of things like battery technology, the raw materials for batteries, it becomes, again, a a security issue. It becomes securitized. So what was once a point of convergence has become increasingly subject to these external policy issues where the narrative has completely changed.
Narratives are being used also strategically in this power dimension to create identities to which groups stick, and to create stories that facilitate identification with an in-group. So my question to the three of you would be like, how can we encourage in a practical manner to communicate responsibly, given the enormous challenges that Duncan has put on the table?
If I may start, I want to add one point, that is listening. And why am I adding that? Because I mean, I used to work as a diplomat, and I also studied a bit of mediation. If you want to resolve a conflict, or if you just want to be successful in your negotiations, the number one thing you should do is to listen to what your partner, what your counterpart is saying. Listen to the narrative and understand it. So you just talked about truth not leading us, or not necessarily leading us anywhere. I would say in a successful mediation process, truth is absolutely unnecessary, because you are not there to find the truth, you are there to find a solution. And in order to find a solution, you have to listen to the narratives, and you have to take them very seriously. And that's where I see a huge gap on the one hand, and just a void, because we are not listening. So what we do is we regularly dismiss the narratives coming from China. And China does basically the same, or almost the same. I wouldn't say it's completely the same, but very similar. As long as it goes like this, there is no hope to de-escalate this situation. So no matter which area you look at. So narratives is the number one you have to listen to.
You know, if you're afraid that something nasty is going to happen, it becomes more and more difficult to listen. So what would you say to that, given that all these strategic narratives are exercises in power?
Now that you mentioned fear, I want to connect fear with knowledge. So once you start having fear, it also means you basically turn away from wanting to know more about the thing that causes you fear. So you get into a downward spiral where fear induces lack of knowledge, but lack of knowledge induces even more fear, because it is always the unknown that you most fear of. So I mean, it is a spiral that you need to find ways to get out of, but it's very, very difficult, of course. And that's why I put listening at the first place. But over to you.
I think that the basic way that our public debates about foreign policy are structured are very problematic. And I'm speaking from my own, my personal view, my political view of how these debates go, is that they're not very democratically accountable, they're not very representative, and they're not very, and in terms of knowledge production, they're not very independent. And by that, I mean that a lot of knowledge about international politics is not produced in the countries where it's consumed, right? Here in Holland, when we formulate our foreign policy, we are relying a lot about information provided by allies, right? Why I mention these things, democratic accountability, representativeness, and knowledge production, is because if you don't have these things, if you don't have, let's say, a public break on politicians when it comes to how they behave in relation to other countries, if there is no public investment in foreign policy, then as a consequence, there are no barriers, there are no serious consequences for foreign policy mistakes. And you see this in the aftermath of the war of Afghanistan. Of course, it features into public debates in the US, but there haven't been personal consequences for the people who have made these mistakes. And the same goes for the war in Iraq. So I think if we want to talk about a solution, if we want to talk about a means to move forward and to reduce fear or reduce, let's say, irresponsible policymaking, then we need to generate a real public discussion about foreign policy, which means free access, which means different opinions, it means breaking the think tank bubbles, and it means introducing real dilemmas, which it's no longer sufficient. I think I'll give you just one example of how this would work. I think the restrictions on information of the public to information about foreign policy are excessive. And I think countries need to be more courageous in sharing information about diplomatic relations, because it's only when this information has become more widespread that the public becomes less susceptible to fear-mongering. So these are very difficult issues, very difficult topics, but I'm just putting them out there because they should be part of the conversation from my perspective.
Thanks for that, Steven. Duncan, what are your reflections?
Increased communication is certainly something which we should be looking for. And communication which is open-minded or looking for solutions rather than looking to raise increasing problems and increasing barriers. Ultimately, if we really believe that, for instance, climate change is an existential threat, it should be more or less determining every aspect of our domestic policy, but also our external policy, our foreign relations. At the moment, it isn't, and it isn't in Europe, and it isn't in China. So I think efforts at communication and dialogue are certainly part of a broader framework of communication and responsible communication.
Thanks very much to all three of you, Duncan Freeman, Steven Langendonk, and Ágota Révész, for this conversation, bringing so much to the table. We've learned a lot about a bit of the psychoanalysis of the unicorn and the dragon, and I thank you all for that.